574 to the 219 up in here. I am J to the C to the checkmate up with you. Just feeling silly today. We're going to continue our examination of isolated pawns. We're going to flip the board real quick because we are looking at it from Black's perspective in this particular game. White's going to have the isolated pawn. The two players, White is Theodor Regedzinski, which the player we know of, Akiba Rubinstein, was from Poland, so probably just a generic Polish local player. Black is played by Akiba Rubinstein. Just a quick aside, if you don't know much about Akiba Rubinstein, change that right now. Akiba Rubinstein is the father of modern chess. No matter what opening you play, he had some influence exerted upon it somehow. There's so many things in modern chess that he either literally invented or influenced. If you're studying endgames, just from looking at his endgames, especially rook endgames, you could basically learn everything you need to learn. He was far ahead of his time. He doesn't get enough recognition because he never managed to play for a world championship or win a world championship. But he was a lot more influential than, say, even Lasker. Lasker is my favorite world champion, but he was much more of a practical player. He won, but he had a much more limited influence on the course of chess thought and chess history. Rubinstein never won the title, but he had such a huge impact on chess theory and chess thought and the way chess developed in a modern sense. Just an incredible player. If you don't know much about his games, give it a look. So we're going to look at one of his games today. He was black against Theodor. D4, D5, knight f3. Just an aside, you'll notice in a lot of older games, they played this... played knight to f3 on the second move. The reason for that I've seen in the historical records, is they were worried about the Albin counter gambit, which is this. And that's funny to say with modern sensibilities, because now with modern sensibilities we recognize, my personal favorite here is knight bd2, but we recognize that it's a complicated position and black has a little bit of compensation, but no player with the white pieces should be afraid of the Albin counter gambit. There's no reason to avoid it. You'd want to encourage it just because it's a pawn, and you're willing to do some work for a pawn. But back then, they were probably still weaned on the Romantic tradition, so they were more afraid of being attacked, which, with modern sensibilities, we're more eager to defend if we get some material for it. But knight f3, c4, e6, bishop g5. This seems like a harmless transposition, but this could be something if black decided to do something with it. Quite often, it just transposes. So Rubinstein just plays knight bd7, so it just goes straight back to normal queen's gambit decline. Rubinstein could do something here. He could try to punish white. And this punishes white because on e4, there's no knight on c3, so black is in time to save this pawn on c4. And this is meaningful. I think white's fine here, but white certainly isn't better, and this is a very interesting and double-edged game. But most people just play knight bd7 and transpose back to the normal queen's gambit declines, but just an aside. Knight c3, we're just back into the main line. So this is the standard queen's gambit decline position from which all blessings flow. Theodor played bishop d3, which again, if you've seen it in my videos in the past couple weeks, is my least favorite move here. Queen c2 would be the Rubinstein attack, and Rubinstein would be facing this as black. Again, this is another just pure main line of the Queen's Gambit that Rubinstein invented and trailblazed. Just an astounding player with an astounding influence in chess history. But Queen c2 is my personal favorite here. Problem with bishop d3 is that immediately, so in these positions, you'll often get what's called the battle for the tempo. So whenever the light square bishop moves, black can take on c4. And that costs white time. That forces white to lose time regaining that pawn. So, especially if you look at some older games, you'll see a really weird long dance. So let's just play some random moves. So rook c1, then black will play c6. So we can't move the bishop yet, so we'll play queen c2. We'll play rook e8. Can't move the bishop yet, so we'll play a3. Play a6. Don't want to move the bishop yet, so we'll play h3. And so forth like that. It sort of becomes to a reductio ad absurdum points where you just lose the tempo and get on with life. But bishop d3 is too early. This gives away the battle for the tempo without even a fight, and black's able to equalize without any problems. So take, that forces white to lose time. And then a6, and that's standard in these Queen's Gambit decline positions. To get b5 in, usually black has to play c6 and then a6. He has to play both moves to enforce that move through. And then once he's played c6, he'll want to play c5 a little bit later, which is what he does in the semi-Slav, like the Moran, but it loses some time. Whereas here, black is just threatening to play b5 in one go, and then c5 in one go. So that's a huge savings in time, plus white has lost that tempo taking back on c4 by moving the bishop twice. So this is a very comfortable position for black. This is completely equal right now. Castles, this is a mistake. White needs to stop that queenside expansion. And then after that, I mean, black can play b6 is fine. My personal choice would be c5. And then this is a decent Queen's Gambit decline position for black. Probably b6 is best now that I think of it, but both moves are fine. But castle just allows that expansion. And black is very comfortable here. There's no way to stop c5. The fact that he's achieving that without having played c6, this is a vastly improved semi-Slav for black. Black's a little bit better here. So white's sort of thrown away his advantage of the first move pretty quickly. Queen e2, lackadaisical move. The queen doesn't do anything on e2. It doesn't. There's nothing that queen does on e2 that it wasn't doing on d1. That's true. It connects the rooks, but it's just sort of a move for the sake of a move. White could at least play queen c2 to sort of hold the knight on f6 in place. And something like c5, a4. And white gives up the bishop pair, but at least here, he's getting some pressure on black's queenside pawns. He's trying to prove that b5 is potentially a mistake having played so early. He's not afraid of losing the bishop pair, because there's no way to take advantage of this pawn weakness. If anything, it helps control some important squares, so white's not unhappy about this. Black would be slightly better here because he does have the bishop pair, and that is a resource. But it's nothing so disastrous for white just yet. But queen e2 is a lackadaisical move. So c5, this is just the standard expansion. Black is definitely slightly better now. Rook a d1, simply not the best. a3 would at least... a3 still fits with an isolated pawn if black decides to transition, and it stops b4, so it gives the knight on c3 a little bit of stability. Something like h6. And black is for sure better. You know, he's got easy follow-up moves like rook a c8, rook f d8. He has two easy squares for his rooks. And then he can choose a plan. He can transition to an IQP and attack d4. He could play c4 and try to get a general queenside march going, stuff like that. He's a very flexible position. But rook a d1 is definitely not the best move. Rubinstein decides to transition, which is probably a good idea at this point. He could also play b4 and then c after the knight moves. But this is a good time to transition. E takes. If the white knight takes back to avoid the isolated pawn, b4 is incredibly awkward, because now the white knight doesn't have access to e4 like it would if the white pawn were on d4. So the knight's sort of sent into exile. After knight b1, queen a5, there's actually not a good way to guard that pawn on a2, because the knight, bishop on f6 or bishop on g5 is being hit. So after something like that, let's say something like that. It's a good move. We'll just develop. Yeah, I mean, black is extraordinarily comfortable here. He's got the bishop pair. The bishop on b7 is an absolute monster. You know, black could suddenly transition to a kingside attack if he wanted to. This is very comfortable for black. This is at least a small edge. So exd4 is necessary. Knight b6, maybe Rubinstein's first micro-inaccuracy of the game. h6 is probably best. h6 is fine to play when there's not really a threat of a kingside attack. We saw in our previous games that h6 can often be a weakness if white can enforce some type of rook lift to take advantage of h6 and g7 as weaknesses. Here there's no threat of white doing that, so white can just kick that bishop back. So on bishop d2, queen b6. Black can just start targeting this, the d-pawn. And as of yet, white doesn't have any counterplay on the king side to really prevent black from doing that. The problem with knight b6, and this is just like every other game that we've looked at in our series, you don't want to necessarily control d5. Controlling d5 is good up to the point of preventing d5 as a pawn break. but the goal isn't to have your knight sitting on f6 and d5. In so many examples, we saw that the knights sort of cancel each other out on those squares, and it's not terribly active for black. Black should be on the lookout for creating his own play. So knight b6, it's not a huge issue. Black is still better in this position, but maybe a little micro inaccuracy. Knight e4. This is absolutely the wrong course of action. You don't want to be trading pieces in an isolated queen-pawn position. When you have an isolated queen-pawn, you want to keep as many pieces on the board as possible, especially minor pieces. Minor pieces are sort of the engine of your attacking potential when you have an isolated queen-pawn, especially the light-squared bishop. And this is more or less acquiescing to giving up the light-squared bishop, and that's devastating to white's chances for an attack. Knight e5 would just be a standard isolated queen-pawn move. So rook c8. And rook c7 is one potential move that I sort of like here. It makes queen a8 possible, which I play the ready as white, so whenever I can play a move like that, it sort of appeals to me. Black's slightly better here, but there's still plenty of game to come. Whereas knight e4 completely sentences white to a passive defense. We're just trading too many pieces off the board. Rook fd8, rook d3. It just doesn't make any sense here. Maybe in a different position with more minor pieces and more kingside pressure, this rook lift would be meaningful. But it simply isn't, and it just disconnects white's rook at a bad time. Just rook fd1. I mean, white's worse, and there's no way he's not going to be worse. But this at least mobilizes his last piece and gets it into the game. But rook d3 just doesn't accomplish anything. Bishop takes. And this, I said yesterday that Floor achieved a model game against the isolated queen pawn. If there is a position that's better, it would be this position. This truly is a model of what you're looking for against the isolated queen pawn. The main thing to do when defending against an isolated queen pawn is to trade minor pieces off the board. Minor pieces are the engine of activity for an isolated queen pawn, especially for the bishop opposite the color of the isolated queen pawn. So in that position, it was white's light-squared bishop. With that off the board, there's no pressure on h7, which is, as we saw in our other examples, that battery against h7 was often the engine to generate a play against the king side to begin with. Without that battery, there's no way to enforce weaknesses on the king side, and there's no way to get further play against the king side. So with 3 sets of minors off the board, white just doesn't have any activity. We want to keep the rooks on the board because we want those rooks to be able to line up on the d-file and batter that pawn. So if black had a couple of free moves here, he would play rook d5, rook c d8, and then queen d6. And then he would have a humongous battery going against the d4 pawn. That's the model for what you want to achieve against the isolated pawn. Minor pieces off the board, especially the bishop that can target your king side, and then batter the isolated pawn with major pieces. Rubinstein does it a little bit different in this game. He was a very artful endgame player, so however he did it is perfectly correct, because he's Rubinstein. But this is a model game. Play over this game as many times as you need. This is exactly how you play against an isolated pawn from here. d1, knight d5, occupying the hole. Knight f6, chasing the queen away. Queen b7. So notice that the knight just doesn't stand on d5. We saw that as a disease for a lot of black's positions earlier. Again, the point isn't to just sit on d5. A knight's good on d5, but you can use that as a transition point to get to other parts of the board. There are other squares that matter. Here, black is going to keep that d5 square open to potentially use for his queen to try to generate weaknesses on the queen side. Again, this is something I repeat in every video. The principle of 2 weaknesses, in my opinion, is the fundamental principle of how to play endgames correctly. 1 weakness isn't enough. So white has this weak d-pawn. That's not enough to win the game. Black needs to generate another weakness in another part of the board to stretch white's defenses apart. If it were just the weakness of the d4 pawn, white could just pile his pieces up defending that, and he would probably be able to defend at least. Black is going to try to generate another weakness somewhere else and try to stretch white's defenses out. So h3, h6, queen d5, and this is exactly what I was talking about. The queen is going to hit the queen side and try to generate another weakness. And Theodore is a very compliant b3. It doesn't weaken a pawn, but it weakens the c3 square. So now black has a very easy penetration square for his rooks on the c-file. And that's the second weakness that Rubinstein can use to penetrate white's position decisively. Better would just be queen a3. This looks ugly, but it hits the a6 pawn, but more importantly, it avoids a weakness. Pawns can't move backwards, so any pawn move is incredibly substantial. So when you're defending, you want to try to hold your pawn moves as much as possible to avoid creating weaknesses. But b3, that creates a weakness in the c3 square. Queen d6, 5, queen f4. So the fact that the rooks are disconnected on the back rank, that makes queen f4 incredibly well timed. That hits. Now black is threatening rook x c1 check. So now white is forced to trade some pieces off the board at a bad time. So rook c2, queen takes, and now knight b4. This is absolute perfect timing. Rubinstein would have seen this position back when he played queen f4. Because if he didn't have the knight b4 resource, he's just giving up the c file, which generally isn't what you want to do. But after knight b4, it's hitting the a2 pawn, and to keep it guarded, white has to give up the d file, or c file. So, excellent calculation for Rubinstein. He would have had to see this. And now rook c8. This is classic rook endgame technique in general. Forcing the open file into your possession, then using that as a penetration point. Just perfect technique. Rook c1. And then going after the weak a pawn. Just once you penetrate to the back rank, your rook can sort of go where it wants and attack whichever pawns are the weakest. And he trades the rooks off. Sometimes, just an aside, you want to avoid trading if your pieces are active enough. So the a1 rook is much more active than the b2 rook. So sometimes it profits to... he could potentially profit from playing knight xa2 and avoiding trading. But Rubinstein does the easy thing. One of the things Botvinnik came up with, one of the generalities, is that knight endgames are very, very close to king and pawn endings in terms of their mechanics and how they play. So with a pawn up and a weak pawn at d4, this is just a winning endgame for black. And we'll just go over it quickly. Knight e5, bring the knight back into play. Knight b7, f6, sort of cuts the knight off. King f7. And white resigned here because he suddenly realized that his knight is actually trapped. So just a couple of example moves. Let's say f4. Let's say king d8. Approach this way to avoid the check on c8. Yeah, and suddenly the knight's trapped. It genuinely has nowhere left it can go. So, yeah, I mean, he can sort of try to bail out into something like this. And suddenly this is just busted. The pawn's going to run away. But otherwise, the knight just steps over to collect the wayward knight, and it's still winning position either way. So, classic game from Rubinstein. This is exactly how you want to play against the... go back to this position. This is really where white's woes began. When black was able to get this queenside expansion going. This sort of position, this is a sort of a sign of a favorable isolated queen pawn for the side defending. The light square bishop found a perfect spot. A lot of times against the IQP, one of your millstones is finding a way to get the light square bishop into the game. Black never had to worry about that. It had a beautiful diagonal immediately. A lot of times you'll have to worry about kingside pressure. Because black is so well developed, he never had to worry about white's pieces swarming his kingside. Black was just able to develop pressure against the isolated queen pawn and on the queen side without white really ever offering counterplay on the king side of his own. So, classic game. As usual, I'll have the notes in the annotated PGN file in the notes of the video. We're going to continue with this next video tomorrow. We're going to continue to look at ways to combat the isolated pawn to liquidate into a favorable endgame. So, my name is Sourtile, and I'll see you then.